Alright, this video I'm just going to read a paper I wrote about how Homer is discussed in Plato's Republic, and I will talk more about the Republic in the future. I just want to give you an idea of, if you read the dialogues the way I do, that they start out in the cave, turn toward the light, go back to the cave, that there are two fundamentally different ways to live, two roads, and that what courage means in the cave is fundamentally different than what courage means in the realm of the light. There's a fundamental difference between philosophical courage or temperance and unphilosophical, or Neanderthal is what I call it, caveman, based on the assumption that people are rational by nature versus based on the assumption people are irrational by nature. By irrational, I mean the appetitive soul is by far the greatest, and so the city has to repress it. It has to have soldiers or enforcement or constantly on guard to discipline people or other countries because those irrational drives are always a threat. Whereas the view of the philosopher is that it's natural to love wisdom. The soul is not internally conflicted. It's not battling with itself. It has integrity. The dark shadow is integrated, and the philosopher has a passion, an erotic passion for wisdom. Anyway, so I'm talking about the Republic and what Socrates says about Homer in the first third, then in the second third, and then the Glaucon doesn't get it, he doesn't learn the lesson, and back to the last third of the dialogue. So he trashes Homer in the first third and the last third, and he honors Homer in the middle. And people need to notice these things. And that there's irony, reversal, and recognition, that you need to think critically about what's really going on. Don't take anything at face value. Learn to think twice. Learn to assume there's going to be some kind of reversal. There's a difference between what appears to be happening and what's actually happening. Anyway, so this is just how to take that tool of interpretation, which again is consistent with Greek paideia, and apply it in specifically looking at what Socrates says about Homer in the Republic. The account of Homer and religious education in the Republic is presented in three separate places. The first under the assumption that people are irrational, the second under the assumption that they're not, and the third returning to the original assumption. The three aspects to the discussion of Homer follow the same pattern as the dialogue as a whole, beginning in the cave, turning toward the light of the mind, and then turning back toward the cave, this time with the ability to analyze Homer and popular responses to Homer through the light of reason. Curiously enough, in Book 7, when Plato is clearly talking about the kind of imitation a philosopher engages in, he includes Homer among the philosophers. Quote, "As they work, they'll look towards the natures of justice, beauty, moderation, and the like, until they produce a human being based on what Homer too called the divine form and image when it occurred among human beings." Unquote. Something is clearly wrong with the standard view that Plato rejected Homer. The entire account of Homer needs to be viewed in the light of the dramatic context, beginning with what Glaucon and Adimantus say at the beginning of Book 2 about the religious education they have received. Glaucon claims that he's been taught that a completely unjust person, quotes, makes adequate sacrifices to the gods and sets up magnificent offerings to them. Hence, it's likely that the gods, in turn, will take better care of him than of a just person. That's what they say, Socrates, that gods and humans provide a better life for unjust people than for just ones. Adimantus adds, if the rich person or any of his ancestors has committed an injustice, they can fix it with pleasant rituals, and the poets are brought forward as witnesses to all these accounts. Unquote. The immediate setting points to the pervasiveness of this view. Cephalus has just left the gathering because he's doing just this, engaging in sacrifices so that he will get to Hades after he dies, or to the right part of Hades, even though he spent his professional life getting extremely rich by selling military hardware to support the Athenians' unjust wars, and by spending his leisure time preoccupied with sex and drinking parties. Glaucon's and Adimantus's authority figures have misread Homer and are using it to justify their own irrational ways of living, and to encourage their sons to do the same. Socrates agrees to the misinterpretation because he's focused on the education of Glaucon and Adimantus, not on literary criticism or respectable theology. Explicitly, Socrates advocates censorship of Hesiod and Homer because the stories of the gods contain all sorts of irrational behavior, and, quote, the young can't distinguish what is allegorical from what isn't, and the opinions they absorb at that age are hard to erase and apt to become unalterable. Unquote. Socrates advocates only those theological teachings that say God is good. Quote, God isn't the cause of all things, but only of good ones. Unquote, and that, quote, people are wretched because they're in need of punishment, and that in paying the penalty they are benefited by the gods. Further, a god, then, is simple and true in words and deed. He doesn't change himself or deceive others by images, words, or signs, whether in visions or in dreams. Unquote. On the assumption that the stories in Homer are intended to get audiences to imitate the behavior Homer describes, Socrates criticizes stories of heroes whining and complaining because, he says, a decent man will, quote, least give way to lamentation and bear misfortune most quietly when it strikes. We'd be right, then, to delete the lamentations of famous men. Unquote. Of course, you're thinking of Achilles. Further, quote, they mustn't be a lover of laughter either, for whenever anyone indulges in violent laughter, a violent change of mood is likely to follow. Unquote. There should be no stories about immoderate behavior, drinking, eating, sex, no stories about money-loving, quote, will compel the poets either to deny that the heroes did such things, or else to deny that they were children of the gods. Unquote. Socrates condemns the poets, quote, what poets and prose writers tell us about the most important matters concerning human beings is bad. They say that many unjust people are happy and many just ones wretched, that injustice is profitable if it escapes detection, and that justice is another's good but one's own loss. Unquote. The argument against Socrates' interpretation and criticism here is that these stories are supposed to be cathartic. The readers are supposed to pity the characters for their ignorance and suffering, then fear for their own capacity to make the same mistake and suffer, and then have a purgation of pity and fear, so they can face life with all of its difficulties and not be overcome by irrational emotions or choose unjust actions. Homer and Hesiod should be read as intended to improve people by showing them the human condition for what it is and having them learn from the mistakes of others. The reason Socrates does not interpret the poets this way, however, is because the adults of Athens no longer know how to read their own religious texts. They are reading them literally, assuming we are intended to imitate these emotions and actions rather than to learn how to avoid them. If no one can read Homer and Hesiod anymore, the texts will have to be censored. Apart from whether this is a fair reading of the texts or not, if parents teach their children that the gods are irrational and unjust, therefore we can also be irrational and unjust, then these texts are having a morally corrupting influence on society. If the Athenians think Homer believes the gods can be bribed, apart from whether this is a fair reading of Homer, then the book should be censored. Censorship, however, and government control of speech makes the so-called ideal city look a lot more like Sparta. The view that the censorship of Homer needs to be understood within the context, not literally, is pointed to implicitly when Socrates explains that all of Homer's works are spoken through the voice of Chrysias, a priest, a Delphic priest. So Homer is taking Chrysias' point of view. Either it's impossible to find Homer's point of view, or readers have to dig to find it. It is not the voice of the narrator. Agamemnon mistreats Chrysias, and Chrysias prayed to the gods by asking, quote, in return that the arrows of the god Apollo should make the Achaeans pay for their tears, unquote. The implication, then, is that Homer's works are stories of where the Achaeans went wrong. The voice of the narrator is of a man taking revenge on the Achaeans, and what they do when they lost their mind, when they lost their reason. They are getting their just desert from the Delphic priest, a messenger of the god of reason, Apollo. Perhaps all of their suffering is Apollo's revenge for their mistakes in judgment. Socrates says tragedies are like that, too, implying that the tragedians do not speak in their own voices, but take on the perspectives of their characters. Careful readers should think about what the point of the literature is: to make readers aware of the radical insecurity of the human condition, to get them to see the blindnesses of the heroes and gods so they don't commit the same mistakes, to let them know that the honest guys sometimes experience unjust treatment but should not give in to self-pity and fear, and to make them aware of how often we think we're making judgments about justice and injustice, but we're wrong. The purpose of these texts is education, but the Athenians don't seem to get it. There's another reason to question a literal interpretation of Socrates' censorship of the poets in the so-called ideal city. Plato's own dialogues fit the same description he gives of Homer's work. Plato's works are spoken through the voice of Socrates and are in the style of Socratic dialogue. Athens mistreated Socrates, and Plato is making them pay for their injustice. But Plato's dialogues aren't about revenge. Socrates says in Book 1 that one should never harm enemies, or anyone. Rather, Plato's dialogues are about the way reason, or Apollo, took revenge when the Athenians rejected reason and became self-indulgent, greedy, and power-hungry. The Athenians were given a legal constitution that was founded on the rule of law over the rule of one or a small group of rulers with absolute power. The law was written to encourage the development of higher levels of reasoning among a comparatively large number of citizens. Instead of cultivating their reason, following the divine image in human nature, they rejected the divinity represented by the priest, and chose material pleasures and power. Plato's dialogues are the story of the so-called revenge of Apollo when the Athenians turned away from the love of justice and truth and ended up electing a tyrant, Critias, who ran a 9-month dictatorship before being ousted. Whenever human beings turn away from their capacity to live for what is just by nature, they experience great tragedy and suffering. Both Homer and Plato, then, are showing the Greeks and the Achaeans what not to do, what temptations or blindnesses they have that they must overcome. Like tragedy and epic poetry, Plato's dialogues also in the voices of his characters, not in Plato's own voice. Plato's characters are types of people. Each of Plato's dialogues is named after someone who made a mistake in judgment, leading to the tragedy of the fall of Athens. We can learn from their mistakes. Also, each of the mistakes is an obstacle to the life of the mind. We need to get over all these obstacles before we can exercise all the powers of that way of life. Plato's dialogues present a model of the person whose life we should imitate, Socrates. But, like Homer and the tragedians, he also includes all other types, good and evil and in between, so we can recognize the people in the dialogues as representing the people in our lives. The ways these people relate to each other in the dialogues are analogous to our own experience. There's an important reason for poetry to include all types. One cannot live well without being able to live among people, recognize their characters, and treat them appropriately. Unlike the poets, however, it's clear in Plato who the good guy is, and how far from that the other characters are. Somehow the Athenians lost track of who the good guys were in their sacred texts. The indirect reference to Plato's own dialogues becomes even clearer when Socrates says, quote, "When a moderate man comes upon the words or actions of a good man in his narrative, he'll be willing to report them as if he were that man himself, and he won't be ashamed of that kind of imitation," unquote. Of course, the Republic is exactly this kind of narrative. Plato's reporting this narration in the mouth of Socrates, a good man. Good people have read about Socrates and tried to imitate his way of life as it is presented in Plato's dialogues for 2,300 years. Socrates goes on, quote, "When he comes upon a character unworthy of himself, however, he'll be unwilling to make himself seriously resemble that inferior character, except perhaps for a brief period in which he's doing something good. Rather, he'll be ashamed to do something like that, both because he's unpracticed in it, in the imitation of such people, and because he can't stand to shape and mold himself according to a worse pattern. He despises this in his mind, unless it's just done in play," unquote. This quote is hinting at the notion of catharsis. It is possible to portray bad characters if the purpose is to do something good. The good that is done is to recognize evil, juxtapose it with good, show that good is preferable to evil, and come up with an argument that justice by nature will lead to greater happiness. This, of course, is what Plato has done. Socrates' self-described task in the Republic is to show the powers of both justice and injustice in the city and the soul, and to convince Glaucon and Erymanthus that they should choose to love justice for its own sake. Not to include the dark side of life would be an incomplete account, but to include only the irrational side of human nature would also be a mistake. Plato defines a philosophical imitator in Book 6 and an unphilosophical imitator in Book 10. The former is closest to the truth, as close as a human being can get. He counts Homer among the imitators of the divine image in humankind. The sophists are unphilosophical imitators, 3 removes from reality and the truth. With these two models in mind, we should turn to Plato's criticisms of Homer in Book 10. On the surface, Plato has returned to criticizing Homer for being 3 removes from the truth. Upon closer examination, there's plenty of evidence that Plato thinks Homer is seeking to educate people to see with their minds the divine image in humanity and to desire to imitate it. Socrates gives 7 criticisms of Homer, which all apply to Plato's own works and to Socrates' life as much as they apply to Homer. Then, when Glaucon makes clear that he still doesn't get what Socrates is pointing him toward, Socrates gives some criticisms of Homer, which assume Homer is an unphilosophical imitator, just another sophist. Plato's criticism of Homer also apply to Plato. Number one, an active life is superior to a contemplative life, and action is superior to teaching. Plato does not think so. Socrates' first argument for why Homer should be considered three removes from the truth is a problem that Plato could also be accused of. He says Homer must be a pseudo-imitator, a sophist, because if he could have made people the way he wanted them to be, he would have engaged in teaching and action, not in writing. Quote, do you think that someone who could make both the thing imitated and its image would allow himself to be serious about making images and put this at the forefront of his life as the best thing to do? Unquote. Clearly, Plato could be accused of the same thing. Why did Plato bother to write dialogues if he could have developed a foolproof system for activating the minds of other people, for making people good? Plato is implicitly arguing for the contemplative life, a life which includes writing, over the life based on action only. He's not only implicitly showing the value of writing, but also showing that Homer himself was a contemplative who passed on a vision, through writing, of the best way of life as he saw it. Plato is criticizing the obsession of the people of his day with the excess honor of love and action, rather than the love of learning and contemplation. Socrates goes on, quote, if he truly had knowledge of the things he imitates, Homer would have been much more serious about actions than about imitations of them, would try to leave behind many fine deeds as memorials to himself, and would be more eager to be the subject of a eulogy than the author of one. Unquote. This criticism also applies to Plato. Plato's dialogues present both a way of life and an educational system which serve as the foundation for that way of life. The implication here is that action without reflection is blind. There is a need for education. This would fit with Aristotle, who says the theoretical person can teach because he knows the causes. So Homer and Plato are the ones who understand the underlying causes, so they can write and they can teach. And their writing is based on archetypes, and people can learn from those archetypes. Okay, criticism number 2. Homer cannot prove his work has made people better. Well, neither can Plato. Plato's second criticism of Homer is also ironic, because it could be applied to Plato and his dialogues also. Socrates says, quote, about the most important and most beautiful things of which Homer undertakes to speak, warfare, generalship, city government, and people's education, about these it is fair to question him, asking him this, Homer, if you're not third from the truth about virtue, the sort of craftsman of images that we defined an imitator to be, tell us which cities are better governed because of you, as Sparta is because of Lycurgus, and Athens is because of Solon. Unquote. But one could ask the same question of Plato. Tell us, Plato, which cities are better governed because of you and your system of education? Plato knew that his dialogues would be read in many different ways and be used to justify all sorts of irrational behavior. The same thing happened to Socrates. His life and teachings were misunderstood. Instead of being appreciated as the only educator who did not corrupt the youth, he was accused of being the only educator who did corrupt them, or the worst one. There's no evidence that Athens was governed any better because of Socrates' efforts, or that the youth, with the exception of Plato, really did learn from him to love justice for its own sake. The possibility of turning toward philosophy, however, is always implied in the background because the author of the dialogues, Plato, was Socrates' success story. Number 3, Homer did not set up an isolated community based on a Homeric way of life. Well, neither did Plato. The third criticism again directs one to Plato. Then, if there's nothing of a public nature, as we are told that, when Homer was alive, he was a leader in the education of certain people who took pleasure in associating with him in private, and that he passed on a Homeric way of life to those who came after him, just as Pythagoras did. Um, okay, so Homer didn't do what Pythagoras did. Plato's academy is an educational institution, and Plato tried to pass on a Socratic way of life, but it was not on the model of the Pythagorean way of life. Both Homer's works and Socrates' conversations take place in the marketplace, in the midst of the action. The goal of Plato's and Homer's educational system was to send students back into the world to use the insight they gained from their education to become philosophical leaders. Once again, this criticism is not fair to Homer, and instead of separating his own work from Homer's, it starts to look more like it than the other moral educators. So Homer is starting to look more like Plato than like any of the other pre-Socratics or sophists or anybody else. Number 4, Homer was not a successful person. Well, neither was Socrates. Fourth, when he criticizes Homer for not being successful like the sophists are, the reader should be particularly alert to the underlying irony. Quote, if Homer had really been able to educate people and make them better, if he'd known about these things and not merely about how to imitate them, wouldn't he have had many companions and been loved and honored by them? Protagoras of Abdera, Prodicus of Chios, and a great many others are able to convince anyone who associates with them in private that he wouldn't be able to manage his household or city unless they themselves supervise his education, and they are so intensely loved because of this wisdom of theirs that their disciples do everything but carry them around on their shoulders. So do you suppose that, if Homer had been able to benefit people and make them more virtuous, his companions would have allowed either him or Hesiod to wander around as rhapsodes? Unquote. This is a thinly disguised compliment. The sophists are popular precisely because they have the same irrational desires as everyone else. They pander to public opinion and manipulate people to achieve their own materialistic goals. Their students admire them and imitate them. On the other hand, Socrates was given the hemlock. It is Homer, Socrates, and Plato who have a divine image in their minds, which they try to communicate through writing and speech. The fact that Homer is not successful is a sign that he's serious, that he wants to educate the Athenians rather than flatter them or pander to their irrational ambitions. The fact that they don't see any difference between Homer and Socrates on the one hand and the sophists on the other indicates that the Athenians are not learning what it is Homer and Socrates are trying to teach. Number 5. Homer wandered around as a rhapsode. Socrates wandered around as a dialectician. Fifth, Plato criticizes Homer for wandering around as a rhapsode, but Socrates also wandered around. The more Socrates criticizes Homer, the more it becomes clear that Homer and Plato are similar in what they are trying to teach and in how they are trying to teach it. After examining these 6 criticisms, readers can come to the conclusion that the purpose of the criticism of Homer here in Book 10 is to distinguish between Homer and the Sophists, and to compare Homer favorably with Plato and Socrates. Homer the rhapsode, whose works were originally passed down orally before being written down, looks very much like Socrates, who taught but did not write anything down. Plato's criticisms of all of the imitative writers are directed at the Athenians, who have misread them and learned the same things from Homer as they learned from the Sophists. Quote, "An imitator has neither knowledge nor right opinion about whether things he makes are fine or bad. Nonetheless, he'll go on imitating, even though he doesn't know the good or bad qualities of anything. But what he'll imitate, it seems, is what appears fine or beautiful to the majority of people who know nothing. All the tragic poets are as imitative as they could possibly be." Unquote. Since Athenians also failed to distinguish between Socrates and the Sophists, it is not Homer's fault that he's being misread. The fact that he's being misread is made explicit when, after making all of these criticisms, Socrates asks Glaucon, quote, "Glaucon, don't you feel the charm of the pleasure-giving muse, especially when you study her through the eyes of Homer?" And he replies, "Very much so." Glaucon does not get the irony of Socrates' criticisms. He can't view the argument from a philosophical point of view. He only understands art and life and Homer from an unphilosophical viewpoint. Socrates' effort to pull him out of the cave and educate him has clearly failed. He's right back where he first started at the beginning of Book 2, with a reading of Homer which leads to moral corruption rather than moral education. On the basis of the way Glaucon and the Athenians are reading and listening to Homer, then, not on the basis of what Homer is actually trying to say, Socrates condemns, quote, "that childish passion for poetry which the majority of people have," unquote. When Socrates realizes that Glaucon hasn't grasped any of the underlying meaning in his criticisms of Homer, the rest of the argument against Homer is based on Glaucon's view, not Socrates' view, that Homer's work is intended to arouse irrational pleasures rather than bring about a catharsis. This is where Socrates is figuring out what type of soul he's speaking to and using the language and the arguments that will try to turn that type of soul around to the love of wisdom. And if all Glaucon can do when he reads Homer is become more irrational, then Socrates will condemn Homer to Glaucon. If people can no longer learn from Homer, if people insist on desiring excess and having all sorts of irrational passions, then the state will have to become more repressive in order to maintain order. This is what happens in books 2 to 4. As long as the soul is assumed to be irrational, it's incapable of transcending pity and fear, so the state will have to censor Homer and limit all poetry to, quote, "hymns to the gods and eulogies to good people," unquote. Ironically, the so-called ideal city in books 2 through 4 is a city ruled much more like Sparta than like Athens. The Spartans trained their men to be good soldiers, to be willing to give their lives to the state in whatever wars the rulers deem necessary. They demand strict control of eating, drinking, sex. They have greater divisions between the economic, military, and ruling classes than Athens does. They are more dedicated to calculating how to train their citizens to behave like sheep and their military like good guard dogs. The Spartans censor free speech, freedom of association. They ban foreigners. They allow only one point of view about life within their city. The Spartans would never allow literature which describes people under the influence of irrational emotions and which tries to cultivate critical thinking. Why would Glaucon, Adimantus, and the other interlocutors agree to the formation of this city and call it the ideal city. This is the real fundamental difference between Athens and Sparta, a difference in their view of human nature. Sparta is based on the view that people are by nature irrational and must be trained like sheep and dogs to have good habits and obey rulers. Athens is based on the view that people are by nature lovers of wisdom. Those who have the ability to be rational must be trained to use their minds, their nous. Those who do not have the ability or have less ability must be encouraged to live a moderate life and to be involved in civic affairs so they can learn how to rule and be ruled in family life, neighborhood life, local politics, and the city's politics. As many people as possible must be allowed and encouraged to engage in the activities of social and political life, to develop their souls to as high a degree as possible. The point of Homer and Hesiod was to enable their readers to have a more fully developed humanity. People who recognize the entire human condition, good and evil, and choose the good over the evil, will provide the most long-term stability. They will be able to identify charlatans among their neighbors and rulers, and either ignore them, argue against them, or banish them. They will teach their children to love virtue for its own sake, but to also be aware of the many ways a life can be turned toward vice and people can suffer unjustly. This is a far better society than that of the Spartans, who are not given any choice. Athens really was fighting for something. Unfortunately, the Athenians forgot what that something was. So, so anyway, makes your heart bleed. The censorship of Homer appears that Plato is censoring Homer. He's not really censoring Homer. Socrates is engaged in a midwifery relationship with his interlocutors. He tells them what they need to hear based on their souls. If all they can learn from Homer is to be irrational, then they have to stop reading Homer. It's just that's not Plato's final word, and it's not a good reading of Homer.